The room was sealed tight, no windows, no warmth. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh white glare across dull navy-gray walls, and a single metal table bolted firmly to the floor. 3 cameras blinked patiently from the corners, their red lights pulsing in slow rhythm, capturing everything, every breath, every pause. Staff Sergeant Mara Vale sat alone at the table. Her palms rested flat against the cold steel, fingers loose, posture straight but relaxed. She didn't shift or fidget. Her expression revealed nothing. Around her stood senior officers in immaculate uniforms, arms folded, backs rigid, judgments already formed. This room was not designed to listen. It existed to decide. Lieutenant General Harold Vance leaned forward comfortably, elbows on the desk. He glanced at her file, then at her face, smiling as if sharing an inside joke meant for the room, not for her. "So," he said lightly, voice carrying, "let's talk about your kill count." A few restrained laughs followed. Just enough. Then silence returned. Mara didn't blink. She didn't adjust her posture or drop her gaze. She remained perfectly still, quiet, grounded, immovable. And in that stillness, the room seemed to shrink, tightening as though bracing for something it wasn't prepared to hear. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true accounts of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Staff Sergeant Mara Vale was in her early 30s, the kind of Marine most people would overlook. Average height, lean build, hair pulled back tight and practical, sleeves crisp, boots clean, expression neutral. Passing her in a hallway, you might assume she worked logistics or some quiet administrative role. No one applauded. Her rank sat plainly on her collar. No bright ribbons, no colorful display of achievement. Nothing that announced what she had done or what she had endured. That was the first reason they doubted her. The second was her file. On paper, Mara Vale's record was deliberately incomplete. A handful of training blocks, deployments listed only by broad regions, citations written cautiously, stripped of detail, paragraphs blacked out, entire pages reduced to stamped lines, meaningless without special clearance. There were gaps that looked like errors. Months where her unit was listed, but her role was not. Commendations without stories. Reprimands that felt oddly sterile, scrubbed clean before reaching official desks. To those in the room, it didn't look like classified service. It looked like favoritism. Some assumed she had powerful connections. Others suspected political protection. A few concluded she was simply a mistake, someone who slipped through the cracks. And today, the system would correct itself. Mara sensed those assumptions without a word being spoken. In the Marines, you learn to read a room the way you read weather. You don't wait for thunder, you watch shifts in the air. She noticed colonels avoiding her eyes. A Navy legal officer gripping her pen like a weapon, ready to corner her on paper. Junior officers mirroring senior postures, as though judgment itself were contagious. Through it all, Mara kept her breathing controlled. In 4-4, hold out for 6. Slow enough to steady her pulse, quiet enough that no one could hear it. Her gaze stayed level, not from fearlessness, but from experience. Too little eye contact reads as weakness. Too much looks like defiance. So she gave exactly what was required. Nothing more. Her hands remained still, not because she was calm, but because she refused to give them visible tension. Years earlier, under different lights, in another room, an instructor had told her the hardest part of service wasn't the mud or the miles. It was standing still while your name became a story you didn't recognize. She felt that memory now, like a steady hand at her back. Mara had enlisted young, fueled by grit more than direction, stubbornness more than fear. She came from a place where feelings weren't discussed, and worth was measured by what you carried without complaint. Her early years were hard in a simple way, long days. Little sleep, constant pressure to earn space without asking for it. She learned quickly that respect in the Marines isn't given for intent. It's earned through consistency. Faces from those years still lived quietly in her mind. A drill instructor who never shouted yet could silence a room with a look. A teammate who taught her to double-check straps not from anxiety, But because lives depended on habits done right every time, those memories passed like distant radio chatter. She didn't let them surface. Not here. Because her current assignment, the part of her life under scrutiny, was the one she could never explain. Her orders sounded harmless to anyone who didn't know how to read between the lines. Liaison, joint coordination, temporary attachment, support role, polite phrases that made her sound like a clerk moving paperwork between offices. But she wasn't there to shuffle documents. She was there because she had been quietly trusted with things the public would never know and some leaders would never admit. That trust came with a cost. Her operational history had been buried behind layers of classification so thick that even senior officers hit walls. The more critical her work became, the less she was allowed to speak of it. The more she carried, the less she could prove. That was the cruel equation. In a system that prized medals and reports, she had been ordered to exist as a blank page. So when they looked at her uniform and saw nothing, it wasn't oversight. It was policy. When they saw redactions and gaps, it wasn't confusion. It was design. And when Lieutenant General Vance smiled, as if her silence meant weakness, he wasn't just mocking her, he was mocking the kind of service that vanishes on command and stays invisible. Mara didn't defend herself because she couldn't. One careless sentence could. Violate orders written in ink far heavier than the rest of her file. She felt that boundary clearly, like a tripwire in her mind. Say too little and you disappear. Say too much and you're destroyed. So she stayed silent, out of fear, but discipline. And discipline can be isolating in a room full of people. Earlier, before the hearing began, a junior officer had passed her table and quietly set down a paper cup of water. No words, no smile. Just a small, human gesture that felt out of place in a room built to harden people. Mara hadn't touched the water. She could feel the distance in the room. This wasn't hatred. Hatred acknowledges significance. This was Calderon's institution dismissing her efficiently, like a document stamped and filed away. Open hostility would have been easier. This was a room full of accomplished men and women, deciding without effort that she wasn't worth understanding. And still she sat there, hands flat on steel, breathing slow, eyes steady, carrying the weight of everything she could not say, because sometimes the heaviest burden of wearing the uniform isn't what you did. It's that you did it tanned. We'll never be allowed to explain why. Lieutenant General Vance didn't raise his voice when he continued. He didn't need to. The room already belonged to him. He leaned back slightly, fingers laced, studying her as if she were a problem he intended to solve publicly. Let's talk about your deployments, he said calmly. Because on paper, they don't add up. He lifted her file and tapped it once. The sound echoed too loudly. Same regions, different units, overlapping dates, assignments that begin without explanation and end without closure. He looked up. That's unusual, even for joint operations. Mara kept her gaze forward. Her breathing stayed steady. In 4-4, hold. Out for 6. South Pacific. Persian Gulf. Northern Arabian Sea. Vance continued, smiling faintly. You've traveled. A chair shifted. Someone cleared a throat. A pen scratched against paper. I'm sure there's a reason, he said. There always is. He tilted his head. Care to explain why your record reads like a travel itinerary, with all the details missing? The question hung in the air. Mara didn't move. Her jaw tightened just enough to be invisible to anyone not trained to see restraint in millimeters. Her hands stayed flat, fingertips resting lightly at the table's edge. I'm not authorized to discuss specific operations, she said evenly. Quiet, controlled, firm. Vance nodded as if he'd anticipated it. Of course you aren't. He exhaled softly, almost laughing. That does seem to be your favorite phrase. A few smiles appeared. The issue, he continued, is that we're not discussing classified targets. We're discussing accountability, who you worked with, what you actually did, whether you were necessary. The word struck harder than the rest. Mara swallowed once. Vance leaned forward. Joint operations require transparencies, especially when a Marine ends up attached to Navy units without a clear role. He paused. Unless, he added, there was no role? The room shifted. Curiosity sharpened. Were you embedded? He asked. Or just along for the ride? The pressure rose behind Mara's eyes. Not anger, but restraint. She knew exactly how to dismantle his assumptions. She also knew she wasn't allowed to. I fulfilled the duties assigned to me, she said. That's not an answer, Vance replied lightly. That's a dodge. Soft laughter followed. He pressed on. Your evaluations, competent, reliable, calm under pressure. He looked up. No criticism, no praise. Very safe wording, safe time. In my experience, he said, that means one of two things. Either you never did anything worth noting, or someone made sure nothing specific was written. He smiled again. Which do you think it is? Mara stared just beyond his shoulder. The room waited for a crack. I followed orders, she said. Vance spread his hands. And there it is. This time the laughter was more confident. The hearing continued like that, question after question, each framed to turn her silence into suspicion. He asked about units she couldn't name. Missions she couldn't confirm. Timeframes she was ordered to treat as non-existent. Each answer was precise, minimal, within limits. Each time, he reframed it. She doesn't remember. She can't clarify. She won't explain. By the time he called for a short recess, the mood had fully shifted. Outside, the hallway filled with low voices. I don't get it, someone muttered. If she did something worth hiding, why put her here? Looks like someone pushed her through. Political, probably. Mara sat alone on a bench, posture straight, eyes lowered. She still hadn't touched the water. Her fingers curled briefly, then relaxed. In that quiet moment, the strain showed in the slight tension at the corner of her mouth. In a breath held just a fraction too long. What would you have done? Defended yourself or stayed silent? When they returned, Vance didn't waste time. Let's address the elephant in the room, he said. Your attachment to a Navy task unit during your last deployment? Mara felt the air shift. That line again. The one she could not cross. According to this, he continued, you were present during direct action operations. He looked at her. Combat adjacent, at minimum.
Ow.
She said nothing. Vance's smile widened. Which brings us back to my earlier question. A few people leaned forward now. In environments like this, he said, everyone contributes in some way. Everyone carries weight. He paused. So it's reasonable to ask what yours was. Mara's chest rose and fell. You're asking me to discuss classified material, she said. I'm asking you to account for yourself, Vance replied. There's a difference. He stood slowly, deliberately, taking a single step closer to her table knot, invading her space, just close enough to be felt. Silence, he said, can mean many things. Discipline, loyalty. He tilted his head. Or it can mean there's nothing there. The room went utterly still. Mara felt the edge now, the point where restraint begins to cost more than it protects. She knew exactly where Vance was pushing her. Speak or appear hollow. Her jaw tightened. She breathed through it. Vance glanced around the room, then back to her. You understand how this looks, don't you, Staff Sergeant? She nodded once. A minimal movement, and you're still choosing not to clarify. Yes, sir. The word echoed. Vance straightened, satisfaction flickering across his expression. Very well. He turned back to the panel. Let the record reflect that the subject has declined multiple opportunities to explain. Discrepancies in her service. Pens scratched as he spoke. Mara stared at the tabletop. The cold steel felt steadier than the air around her. She knew what was coming. She had known the moment she sat down. The questions were narrowing. The room was closing in. Soon, very soon, someone would try to break the silence by force. Something in the room had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was the kind of change you only notice after years around danger, that never announces itself a pressure change, a silence that lingers a beat too long. Rear Admiral Thomas Keene had not spoken since the hearing began. He sat 2 seats down from the presiding table, posture rigid, hands folded, eyes forward. To a casual observer, he looked like any senior officer overseeing a procedural matter. But as General Vance pressed forward, Keene's stillness altered. When Mara declined once more to clarify her role, Keene's gaze lifted for the first time not toward her, but toward the file in Vance's hand. His jaw tightened, the muscle near his ear flexing once before settling again. Controlled, deliberate. It was the look of someone recognizing a boundary being tested by someone who didn't know it existed. Vance continued, unaware, unconcerned. You were present during maritime interdiction activity, he said, scanning the page. That's the language here. A legal officer murmured. Another officer leaned in to read. Mara remained silent. Keene's fingers flexed once, then folded again. The wording was careful, intentionally vague, but occasionally something sharper slipped through a phrase not meant for rooms like this, a term that belonged somewhere else. At one point, a junior staff member leaned toward a colonel and quietly referenced night insertion protocols. Not loudly. Just enough, the colonel stiffened. His eyes flicked toward Keene, then away. Mara felt the shift before she saw it. The way officers stopped leaning back and began leaning forward. The way pens paused mid-stroke. The way skepticism softened into uncertainty. Her once dismissed as passivity now felt wrong to them. People who are empty crack under pressure. They ramble. They argue. They reach for sympathy or engare anything to move the moment. Mara did none of that. She sat exactly as she had from the start. Shoulders squared, chin level, breathing steady. Her eyes didn't dart. Her hands didn't shake. Even as the questions sharpened, her composure remained exact. Almost surgical. That kind of control unsettles people. Vance pressed on timelines. Command relationships. Why a Marine would be attached to a Navy element with no publicly listed tasking. He smiled while he asked. But the smile was thinning. Mara answered when required. Briefly. Precisely. No extra words. When she did not answer. She offered no apology. Keene watched her now not with curiosity, but assessment at one point. Vance referenced a training pipeline that didn't exist in any unclassified system. A throwaway line meant to sound authoritative without being specific. Keene's head turned a fraction. The Navy. Captain beside him noticed and froze. A legal aide frowned, then slowly closed a folder as if unsure it should be open at all. The room felt unsettled, though no one could yet explain why. It wasn't fear. Not yet, it was confusion. Mara sensed the attention, shifting not toward what she said, but toward what she didn't, toward the gaps that no longer felt like incompetence, but barriers. Her silence began to feel less like avoidance and more like containment. At one point, Vance paused mid-sentence, as if expecting her to interrupt. She didn't. The pause stretched. He cleared his throat and continued. Keene adjusted his posture, sitting straighter. His hands separated and rested on the arms of his chair, palms down, a stance more suited to a bridge than a courtroom. A junior officer near the back glanced toward the door, then back to the panel, unease creeping in. No one said it aloud. But the question was forming. What if she wasn't refusing to speak because she had nothing to say? What if she was refusing because saying it would change who had the right to ask? Vance felt it too, though he didn't yet understand it. His humor sharpened. His questions narrowed. His patience thinned. He leaned closer, pressing harder, trying to draw something out of her. Mara's calm didn't crack. It sharpened. She met his gaze, briefly not in challenge, but in acknowledgement. As if to say she understood exactly what he was trying to do, and exactly why she could not let him succeed. Keene exhaled slowly through his nose. The room was quiet in a different way now, not bored. Not amused, but alert. whatever this was. It was no longer just about a Marine with a thin file. Something significant was being brushed against. And everyone could feel it Tevin, if they couldn't yet name it. Somewhere beneath the surface. A line had been crossed. The red lights on the cameras blinked back on one by one. A soft click. A faint mechanical hum as the room prepared to remember everything that followed. People settled into their seats. Postures reset. Expressions neutralized. Procedure reasserted itself. Lieutenant. General Harold Vance straightened his jacket and glanced at the recording indicators, confirming they were active. He wanted this preserved. He wanted witnesses. Mara Vale remained exactly as she had before the recess. Same posture. Same stillness. If the room had changed? She gave no sign. Vance didn't ease back into questioning. He went straight for the edge. Staff Sergeant said. Louder now, sharper authority stripped of humor. Earlier, I asked you a simple question. You chose not to answer. The room quieted instantly. He stepped closer, hands braced on the table, leaning forward just enough to dominate the space without touching it. I'll ask again. In your last joint deployment, how many enemy combatants did you personally neutralize? No smile this time. No softening. Asterisk, this wasn't a joke. It was a challenge. Mara felt the weight settle in her chest, heavy, familiar. The kind of pressure she had trained under. The kind that narrows the world until only one decision remains. Her jaw tightened. She inhaled slowly through her nose. Held it, then released it just as carefully. Then, for the first time since the hearing began, she lifted her head calmly. Deliberately just enough to meet his eyes. The room reacted before she spoke. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward. A pen slipped from someone's hand and clattered softly to the floor. Rear Admiral Keen's spine went rigid. Mara's expression didn't change. No anger. No pride. No hesitation. When she spoke, her voice was low and even precise. 70-3. The word landed like a weight, dropped into still water. No ripple followed. No gasp. No laughter. Just silence. She didn't elaborate. Didn't justify. Didn't explain. She offered no when, no where, no why. She stated the number the way one confirms coordinates or completes a checklist. Vance blinked. Several people stared as if unsure they'd heard correctly. Someone near the back shifted sharply, chair scraping the floor. A legal officer's pen hovered mid-air, ink suspended. 73. Too specific to be a guess. Too clean to be a joke. Too large to be casual. And yet she delivered it without pride, without performance. That was what unsettled them. Had she shouted it, they could have dismissed it as arrogance. Had she said it emotionally, they could have framed it as instability. She hadn't. She spoke like a professional stating a fact. Vance straightened slowly. That's a serious claim, he said, his voice tight. Are you telling this panel you personally accounted for 73 enemy casualties? Mara held his gaze. Yes, sir. Nothing more. A murmur rippled through the room, not laughter, not dismissal. Disbelief. A Marine colonel shook his head. A Navy captain leaned back, recalculating. Someone whispered the number again under their breath. 73. Vance looked around, then back at her. Over what period? What operation? Her eyes didn't flicker. I am not authorized to discuss operational details. The silence that followed felt charged. Vance exhaled sharply. You expect us to believe that number without context, verification, or documentation? I expect you to record my answer, Mara replied. That was all. Keen's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. The cameras continued to hum. Red lights blinking steadily and aware they were capturing something that had slipped beyond their clearance. The room was no longer aligned with Vance. Even those who doubted her now doubted him. The balance had shifted, not completely, but enough to feel. If she was lying, she was doing it with a discipline no one could fake. If she was telling the truth, then something far larger than this hearing was pressing at the edges of the room. Vance sensed his control slipping. He cleared his throat. "And you're comfortable stating that on the record?" "Yes, sir." No pride. No apology. Just certainty. A legal officer whispered urgently to another. A folder was quietly closed. A page turned back. Keen's gaze remained fixed on Morant, with suspicion but recognition. He had seen this before. The calm that doesn't come from confidence, but from containment. From carrying something too heavy to display. Vance stepped back, jaw set. Let the record reflect that the subject has introduced an unsubstantiated claim of lethal engagement. Mara didn't react. She had answered the question. The room didn't yet know what to do with that answer. It sat between them, reshaping the space. Vance had wanted embarrassment, collapse. What he received was a number that refused to explain itself. And in that refusal, the first real fracture appeared in the authority he believed he held. Rear Admiral Thomas Keene stood. The scrape of his chair cut through the room sharper than any raised voice. Every head turned before he spoke. Authority shifted instinctively. "Cut the recording," Keene said. Not loud, but absolute. A technician hesitated, glancing toward Vance. Keene didn't look at them. I said, "Cut it, now." The red lights blinked once, then went dark. The hum faded. The room felt exposed, like a stage after the curtain falls. Keene finally turned to Vance. "With respect, General," he said evenly, "you have taken this hearing beyond your authority." A reaction rippled through the room, silent but unmistakable. Vance opened his mouth. Keene raised a hand, stopping him. "This is no longer a personnel clarification," Keene continued, "and it never should have been conducted in an open forum." His gaze swept the room, measuring clearance the way others measured rank. "Anyone without Joint Special Access authorization will exit immediately." No one moved. Keene's expression hardened. That was not a suggestion. Chairs began to shift. Confused officers stood. Quiet protests followed. The room was changing again, and this time there was no mistaking it. A legal aid gathered their papers with shaking hands. Within moments, more than half the room had emptied, the door closing behind them with a weighty finality. Only a small group remained. Rear Admiral. Keene turned back to Mara Vale for the first time since the hearing began. His expression softened on into sympathy, but into recognition. "Staff Sergeant, said you were correct to remain silent." He addressed the remaining officers. "The operation referenced in this hearing exists. Its designation, scope, and outcomes are classified beyond standard reporting systems." Vance stiffened. "Admiral, if such an operation can cut him off without raising his voice—" "You were not read into it, General, and you were not intended to be." The words landed with the permanence of a correction carved in stone. He continued, tone precise. "Staff Sergeant Mara Vale served in a direct operational capacity under Joint Command Authority. Her assignment was lawful. Her actions were authorized. Her record appears incomplete because it was deliberately redacted." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "She answered your question accurately," Keene said, "and she did so with restraint." No one spoke. Mara remained still, eyes forward, hands steady. The burden she had carried now had a name in the room. If its details did not, Keene turned to her again. "You are dismissed from this hearing, pending reassignment under my authority." Mara rose smoothly and delivered a single, clean, salute-controlled, exact, as she turned to leave. Something remarkable occurred, one by one. Officers stood not because protocol required it, not because rank demanded it. They stood because understanding had replaced assumption. Because judgment had given way to respect. The room was silent as she walked out, her boots striking the floor in measured, even rhythm, and in that silence, everyone left behind understood the same truth. They had not been judging a Marine who refused to speak. They had been in the presence of one who could not. The decision came without ceremony. "Rear Admiral." Keene returned to the table, his voice low and final. "The hearing is terminated, effective immediately. All pending concerns regarding Staff Sergeant Mara Vale are dismissed in full due to classified operational constraints. No appeal. No amendment." No further review. The words were quiet, but they changed everything. General Vance stood rigid for a moment, as though waiting for a continuation that never came. His expression tightened, then flattened. The confidence that had carried him through the hearing drained from his posture. Leaving something brittle behind, Keene continued without looking at him. Staff Sergeant Vale will be reassigned under my direct authority. Her evaluation status is closed. Any attempt to reopen it without my written authorization will be treated as a violation of command protocol. No one objected. No one even shifted. The officers understood this was not a favor. It was a correction. The door opened again, and Mara Vale stepped back into the room. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. Her stride was measured, unchanged from the moment she first entered. If she felt relief, it did not show. If she felt vindication, she did not claim it. Keene faced her. Staff Sergeant, your reassignment is effective immediately. Yes, sir. Nothing more. Then something moved through the room like a soundless wave. Chairs slid back. One officer stood, then another. Then another. There was no command, no signal exchanged. They stood because it felt wrong to remain seated. Because the silence had grown heavier than any order, Mara stopped. For the first time since the hearing began, she registered the room not as a threat, but as a presence. Her gaze moved once, briefly taking it in. Senior officers, legal staff, commanders who had judged her moments earlier, now all on their feet. She did not respond the way people expect in moments like this. There was no visible release. No softening, no smile. She simply squared her shoulders and raised her hand. The salute was clean. Controlled, exact, not hurried, not embellished. The kind given by someone who respects the uniform more than the moment. Keene returned it without hesitation. Around them, the room remained frozen. No applause followed. No murmurs. No whispers. The silence carried more weight than noise ever could. General Vance remained seated. His hands rested on the table where he had once leaned so confidently. His eyes followed Mara but did not meet hers. The contrast was unmistakable. The Marine once questioned for her silence now stood. Acknowledged without speaking, the general, who had spoken the most, sat exposed by his certainty. Mara lowered her hand and turned toward the exit. Her boots sounded against the floor, each step even. Unhurried. The room did not move until the door closed behind her. Only then did people breathe again. Keene remained standing a moment longer, his gaze lingering on the empty doorway. This concludes the matter, he said. No one argued. Outside, the hallway felt brighter, though the lights were unchanged. Mara paused briefly to adjust the strap of her uniform. An automatic habit, then continued forward. She did not look back. The peak had passed not with a speech or spectacle, but with recognition earned through restraint in a system built on rank and volume. It was the quietest Marine who had carried the greatest weight, and everyone who stood had felt it. Mara Vale did not linger after the hearing. She moved through the corridor with the same measured pace she had carried all morning, past doors that now felt smaller than before. The building hadn't changed. The people hadn't changed. But the pressure on her chest had shifted, redistributed into something quieter, more manageable. 2 days later, she stood in a very different room. The Pentagon conference space was wide, bright, and functional. No cameras. No raised dais. No audience. Just a long table, digital maps projected on the wall, and a handful of officers whose attention was focused, not predatory. No one joked. No one smirked. Rear Admiral Keene introduced her simply, no embellishment, no numbers, no war stories. Just her name, her role, and why she was there. The questions were sharp, but clean. They were not traps. They were about patterns, timing windows, behavioral markers, the signals that appear before escalation. What looks like noise until you know how to read it, Mara answered calmly, choosing her words with the same precision she had shown in the hearing. But now the silence between her sentences wasn't hostile. It was attentive. She pointed to a cluster on the map and explained why it mattered. She didn't reference herself. She didn't recount what she had seen or done. She spoke about probability, about repetition, about why certain tactics don't change because they don't need to. A Navy commander challenged her once, politely asking whether field experience truly translated into strategic forecasting. Mara paused, then nodded. Only if you leave your ego out of it. She said, that was all. No one laughed. They listened. When the meeting ended, there was no applause. No congratulations. A few officers nodded as she gathered her notes. One held the door. Another thanked her for her time. It was respect without ceremony, and it felt real as she stepped back into the hallway. A quiet truth settled in. Some warriors are loud because they need to be seen. Others are silent because what they carry cannot be shared. The system often mistakes the second for absence. It rewards volume. It records confidence. It celebrates what can be explained. But truth lives. Elsewhere, respect is not volume. Respect is restraint under pressure, Mara. Vale did not leave with a story to tell. She left with work to do just as she always had. And that, in the end, was the point. Some service is meant to be witnessed. Some is meant to disappear. For every story that ends in applause or medals, there are dozens that end in silence carried quietly. By those ordered never to speak of what they held together, their names never reach headlines. Their records remain thin by design. Their courage lives on without an audience. Mara's story matters not for what she said, but for what she didn't. For the thousands like her, who stand under judgment without defense, trusting that restraint will one day speak louder than explanation. They serve knowing their proof may never come, and they do it anyway. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more veteran stories. These stories keep courage alive for generations to come.